Welcome. Welcome to this year's Leon C. and June Widener-Holt lecture. I'm glad to see everybody's gotten the benefit of the wonderful HVAC here at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. It's a little cold here. Hopefully with the people in the audience, we'll warm up over time. The Holt lecture is about international law, international issues, especially trade issues. And I have to say, I don't think there's a more important moment for us to talk about this topic, or in some sense, a more important speaker to talk about this topic than today's lecturer. Given what's going on in the financial markets, we're clearly focusing on the international economy and how it impacts us and everyone else in the world. I don't know if those of you who may have seen Tom Friedman's column in the New York Times over the weekend talking about poor little Iceland, who found themselves in a bankruptcy situation, and folks in England who had invested in an Iceland bank all of a sudden saw themselves impacted by what was going on Wall Street. Even Friedman himself said the world is a lot flatter than he himself ever thought. So this is really an opportune time to be thinking the questions of internationalization, globalization, and trade. The impetus for this lecture, let me say, came from an alumnus from the law school, Lee Holt, who was an active member of our Board of Overseers and a early chair of our Institute of Law and Economics, which has been a true juggernaut. Lee led, as chair of the board, that institute for a number of years. And as he was stepping back and looking at the law school, he suggested that the next area in which we should really pursue investigation was in the international area. Lee had been a business executive at Air Products and seen firsthand the effect of globalization on his company, and understood the importance not only of understanding other cultures, but the importance of free trade. And it was because of that that Lee really pushed us to improve and expand our international offerings, as well as to establish this lecture. And I would want to just note that we are delighted to have Lee here this evening. Lee, I wonder if you could just stand up. Now, our first Holt lecturer was Dorit Beinish, the president of the Supreme Court of Israel, who gave truly a wonderful discussion about the tensions between democracy and fighting issues of terrorism. Today we have an equally compelling speaker, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, who is world famous expert on issues of international trade. He is a university professor at Columbia University and a senior fellow in international economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a renowned thinker and policymaker. He's been described as the most creative international trade theorist of his generation. He's made enduring contributions to economic thought, such as his work on international flows of skilled labor and his advocacy of the so-called brain tax on natives of developing countries and living abroad. And he has received accolades and awards all over the world, from India to Germany to Switzerland and to the United States. But the accolade, I guess, that may mean most to him by what people say comes from a man he's mentored, Paul Krugman, the Princeton professor, New York Times columnist, and Nobel Prize winner, someone with whom he's jousted on a number of occasions. As a badge of honor, Krugman calls Professor Bhagwati an SOB, a student of Bhagwati. Professor Bhagwati has been called one of the 100 most influential policy intellectuals in the world. Krugman says he believes Professor Bhagwati is the most important scholar in the world on economic trade. Today, he will address what he calls the mistaken critiques of free trade. As you may guess, Professor Bhagwati is in a sense, a strong advocate of international trade, and he's going to defend his position today as he has in a variety of different fora. It was during the 1999 World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle, he debated Ralph Nader before a large and some would describe hostile audience as protesters stormed the streets. I assured Professor Bhagwati that this will be a genteel affair with us today. He was born in India and graduated with a BA in economics from St. John's College at Cambridge and earned his PhD in economics from MIT, where he taught for 12 years. He joined Columbia's faculty in 1980. During that time, Professor Bhagwati has produced a voluminous amount of scholarship. He's published more than 300 articles and authored or edited more than 50 volumes. This includes his most recent book, In Defense of Globalization, in which he argues that globalization is unjustly blamed for everything from the erosion of indigenous cultures to environmental degradation. He also founded the Journal of International Economics, the premier publication in this field. In addition to being an academic, however, he is a public citizen par excellence. He writes frequently for the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, the New Republic, and the New York Times. He's also been an advisor to a number of premier organizations. He's been a top-level advisor at the UN and to the WTO and has worked on the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, whose goal was to reduce barriers to international trade. In addition, he served on a committee which advised UN Secretary General Kofi Annan on development issues in Africa. He is also one of the most revered economists in his native India. As an advisor to India's finance minister, he played a seminal role in steering the country from a socialist model to free market capitalism. The results speak for itself. As one writer said of him, if he can't convert the unbelievers into enthusiastic globalizers, no one can. It really gives me great pleasure, and we're very privileged to have with us an esteemed economic scholar, a policy wonk of the highest order, and a contender himself for the Nobel Prize in Economics, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati.
Thank you, Dean Fitz, for those excessively generous remarks. Mr. Holt, Dean Fitz, and friends, is it coming across? It is, yeah? Okay, good. Raise your hand if you don't hear me right. I'm delighted to be giving this lecture today at your prestigious law school. I've been to Penn before, but in Wharton and an economics department, never to the side of the street. But now that I'm a university professor, I actually also am a professor of economics and law, and I lecture in the law school out there with the assistance, of course, with another professor of international law, who is one of our leading young people on WTO jurisprudence. I'm also particularly delighted because the first lecturer was the president of the Israeli court. My brother, my eldest brother, I come from a family of judges, and my father was on the Supreme Court, and my eldest brother was the Chief Justice of India, and he happens to know her well. And actually, so in a way, it's a kind of pleasant coincidence that I'm number two in this series. I have decided to talk really about the critiques of free trade. Right now, it's a big issue in a way, but from a tangential angle, because of the financial crisis, some people are actually saying that therefore we should throw the trade baby out with the financial bathwater. I don't think it's likely to happen, but we can pick it up in Q&A. But this is simply a non sequitur. And in East Asian financial crisis, for example, that had massive growth rates as a result of outward orientation and trade. But then they went in for premature financial liberalization, going into capital account convertibility without strengthening their banking systems, largely under pressure from US Treasury and from IMF and so on. Those one or two of them actually did it under their own steam. and should not really blame Washington for it. But there was very heavy pressure. And so at that time, the growth rate was quite enormous. I mean, it was called a miracle. It's after all, it's a dreary science, as you know, economics. And so anytime you grow well, that has to be a miracle. I mean, it can't be otherwise. So you had 10% growth rate over 25 years, suddenly you crash, very much like Gorbachev, except that in Russia you were declining, and then you crash after perestroika. But the crash had nothing to do with the reasons why you had very rapid growth. So I was worried that they would actually stop globalization altogether, and they didn't. They stayed with the trade model, and they fixed up the financial one. Now, maybe we're not as smart as East Asians, and we may go into a tailspin, even though we know that in the great crash of 1929, the Smoot-Hawley tariff and the competitive raising of tariff barriers that you had actually led to accentuation of the depression. So sometimes we do learn from history. And I think this is very much in the minds of all the policymakers. But whether the populist reaction and the anti-globalization sentiment, whether that might irrationally lead to something, only time will tell. But I'm an optimist, and I don't think we will be less smart than the Asians. So as an Asian, I probably should not say such a thing. Would say we are smarter than you guys, but I think everybody's smart, and nobody wants to shoot themselves in the foot. And I think that's one thing you learn from history is not what to do, but what not to do. And I think that part is very much easier to learn. So now I will go away from the current situation. As I said, this is the only concern that people might have on trade. Implications for Doha, et cetera. If you want to bring them up, we can discuss that. But today I'll be addressing some of the critiques which have come up in the last 25 years or so against free trade and against globalization more generally. Globalization has several dimensions, but I want to concentrate on free trade as the key issue. In fact, as the current presidential debate illustrates, the traditional fulsome support in the United States for free trade after the Second World War has frayed, certainly among my fellow Democrats. So much so that the British Foreign Secretary David Miliband, the son of the famous Ralph Miliband, who was a very radical sociologist, he was prompted to send in May a warning to Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama to cool their protectionist rhetoric and to draw back from it. As the last Obama-McCain debate showed, however, Obama could not quite play for free trade, obviously, because of overwhelming electoral reasons, which I will turn to later, which are actually pushing us into protectionism, at least as a potential threat. It hasn't arrived yet, but it could, and it will take subtle, insidious forms, not outright protectionism, where we impose great trade barriers and so on. Our post-war history was indeed quite pro-trade. The half-century-long embrace of free trade was common to all presidents, Democrats and Republicans, with some trade liberalization. Most of them were associated with some trade liberalizing initiative, and all supported the multilateral trade negotiations under GATT auspices whenever they happened to overlap with their tenure. These multilateral trade negotiations, as most of you will know, are called rounds, and we're in the middle of, towards the tail end, I hope, of the Doha round. And few know this, of course, in the public. I think even to this date, that the round really represents a trade negotiation. And I think the joke around the Uruguay round was that many people thought that, in fact, it was some sort of new Latin American dance. The dance went on for about 8 years, but I think these are the negotiations which every president has been associated with, virtually, every important president. Even John F. Kennedy, there's a Kennedy round. So the rounds are named after locations or after people, who happen to launch them. So that, the Democratic Party, certainly all of them, Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Clinton, a little bit reluctantly, but he finally got to it in a big way, I think they were all been for it, and certainly the Republicans have been. Let me quote you just one president because I have an angle there, and that is Harry Truman, who in a speech at Baylor University, must have been a different Baylor in those days, in March 1947, he declared very strongly, and I'll just quote from him because I want to, as I said, I want to draw some implication from his statement. He said, "Peace, freedom, and world trade are inseparable. The grave lessons of the past have proved it." So remember, peace, freedom, and world trade are inseparable. The policy of reducing barriers to trade is a settled policy of this government. To those among us, and there are still a few, who would seek to undermine this policy for partisan advantage and go back to the period of high tariffs and economic isolation, I can only say this: times have changed. The slogans of 1930, that's the Smoot-Hawley tariff he's referring to, are sadly out of date. Now, Truman was making the case for free trade, therefore, on two dimensions, not just one. It would advance peace. So he's talking about values, right? Not economic. And secondly, he's implicitly, he's saying elsewhere in the speech, he's talking about economic prosperity. So that is about bringing in, the bacon, as it were. So this is really good for your economic prosperity, but it is good for peace. And if you really, this is it is a two-legged creature, basically. And therefore, it is consistent with your values for the broader implications of your policy. And of course, compared to protectionism, it yields you prosperity, economic prosperity. So I think that's a very important point, and that's what I want to start with, actually, in terms of the different critiques, because some of them relate to values, and some of them relate to economics, okay? And I'll come to that in a moment. But the British history, if you read the history of the British in the case of, movement for free trade and the policy of free trade in the 19th century, there's a very beautiful book by a man called, a historian called Frank Trentman, which shows exactly how even that movement, even though we've always been brought up to believe that it had to do with Cobden and the and the Corn Law League and so on and so forth, that was motivated by economic arguments. There was a huge movement over there too, that it would produce peace and peace and justice and so on and so forth. I was myself startled because I'd never been brought up on that, and it's a beautiful book. You want to go and read that. But that was certainly the way our people thought also, incredibly. Incredibly meaning I didn't know it before I started reading into this. And this was certainly part of the belief in trade in America as well. Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State Cordell Hull was convinced that world commerce led to world peace, and he worked tirelessly for multilateral, non-preferential, that's another angle, multilateral versus all these wretched free trade agreements and so on, which are all preferential. When I say wretched, you know where I stand. So he was for multilateral, non-preferential free trade. In fact, he was awarded, for those of you who don't know, the Nobel Peace Prize. It is unthinkable that a free trade proponent today would get remotely close to it. All right? A lot of times have changed, as Truman said, but once again in the wrong direction. So if you look through the cartoons of the period, because I like to do that, for UK, it is rewarding instead to look at the pro-trade, and there were some anti-trade posters, because the public discourse, the political discourse, was differently conducted at that time in England. The beautiful posters, anyone who wants to see a whole slew of them, the London School of Economics has a nice library which contains all these posters, but that's the way, they sort of put them on walls and all sorts of things. And cartoons, maybe there are some Punch cartoons, but I haven't seen them. But here, there were many, actually. And a Herb Block cartoon, the famous cartoon, it shows, unfortunately, I couldn't bring it with me. I couldn't locate it easily. Shows a protectionist trying to topple an acrobat, marked trade. And with him, the acrobat on top of him, marked justice, and yet another one at the top marked peace. That's the way they thought in those days. right? So the values were very clearly there. Today, free trade is challenged on both counts, not just on economic grounds, but also on values grounds. And those who are altruistic believe that on social dimensions, free trade is malign and not benign. Those who are into self-interest fear that free trade will hurt prosperity and also the distribution of income, namely their wages and jobs. So we have fears which come from self-interest, and we've got concerns which come from altruism, about the social implications. Now, Rabbi Hillel, as all of you know, said of human nature, he said, that if I'm not for others, what am I? That's the altruism part, I guess. And if I'm not for myself, who will be? And that's the self-interest part. So everybody is somewhere on that spectrum. I've not met anyone who's entirely at one end or at the other, but we're all mixtures of these two. And there's nothing wrong about self-interest. Many people try and argue for things which are inspired by self-interest, but they mask it into altruism. And I think that's something which the Democrats are doing right now, which I'll end with, because they're trying to raise labor standards, et cetera, elsewhere, not because they're really worried about workers elsewhere. I mean, some of us are, some people are. But basically, it's with a view to turning Friedman on his head, with a view to actually making the world flat so that the competition from poor countries with lower standards doesn't become too acute. But then they say, we are doing it for your workers. And that's what annoys a lot of people. I mean, just say openly, there's nothing wrong with self-interest. I'm scared. I'm frightened, right? I want to raise the cost of production elsewhere. But please don't come and tell us you're doing it for us. We expect the Bush administration to do that, not the Democrats, okay? So unless, they belong to the same culture, of course, American culture, okay? So there is a certain element of, hypocrisy or whatever you want to call it, or incoherence is a better word, right? I think that's the word I would use. So I think these are two different sets of critiques. One is those who are worried about the social implications or the values aspect, and those who are worried about what happens as a result of competition and self-interest. So the critiques, as I said, fall into these two sets, and so let me just begin with the first, all right, on the social critiques. And that's what mainly the young people are. The way I got into it, as the dean was saying, was in November 99, when the World Trade Organization meeting was held. And I was there, not with any delegation, just with NGOs, actually, because with which I work. And so I was there sort of roaming the streets and debating Ralph Nader and so on and so forth. It was a very hectic time. And there were all these young people militating, all over the place. And I wanted to know what bothered them, what ailed them, so because it was very interesting. There were all kinds of people, there were all kinds of movements, the Falun Gong and then the Hare Krishnas and, people dressed like Sherpas, and it was fascinating, actually. Much more fun than debating Ralph Nader. Though Ralph Nader, my daughter was a Marine for 5 years, and then I debated Ralph Nader at Cornell, and I wiped the floor with him because he'd been handed a book by Lori Wallach, who's got a Harvard law degree. Wrong school. She should have come here. And she had actually briefed him on all these cases involving dolphins and tuna and shrimps and turtles. So the guy was sinking in a mammalian world. I saw him reading his briefing book. It was very easy to destroy him. Because he should have just been his natural self. Because he's a great guy, in my opinion. So anyway, so I thought I would just hit him now again. But suddenly, there was 1,000 people in the audience, and they started, the energy went from them to him, and he threw away this book, and I was really scared at that point. So he got 3 standing ovations. So when it came to my turn, how was I going to handle it? So I remembered my daughter who said she did 100 push-ups a day in the Marine Corps. So I said, I said my daughter was in the Marine Corps and she did 100 push-ups a day, but unfortunately, and I'm sure you can't do any more push-ups than I can. So I said, you've already risen 3 times for Ralph Nader. So no matter how brilliant I am, I'm sure you won't be able to rise again and give me my share of the applause. So I got some, actually, and I worked that out. But I discovered on the streets, basically, not through Ralph Nader and those kinds of discussions, that people were concerned about a variety of issues, which really, like, what's the effect on gender? What's the effect, gender issues? A lot of people are worried about export processing zones using young women. They can't unionize, and therefore they're being exploited. They were worried about equal pay, that might be affected by globalization, child labor, environment, a variety of things like that. Indigenous culture, a la Morales, or mainstream culture, a la Moshe Bové in France, huge numbers of issues like that. And they had nothing to do with whether trade was good for you or bad for you in terms of aggregate national income or anything like that. So the young people were raising what I call citizens' issues, and because that's the age, you have to be altruistic at some age. Some of us hope to be, at all ages, but at least when you're young, you have it. They had the right questions, in my view, but they were too young to have the answers, to have thought about the answers. So I decided to go back and, read something, and then I got involved in it, and then I discovered, that's what the book is about. So the book is about social issues. So it's in defense of globalization, but basically it looks at every conceivable issue that was raised and then sees it from using a lot of evidence for it. The way we economists would describe this, social critiques or social concerns, as basically, in terms of the phrase, does globalization, does free trade have a human face? That's a classic way in political space to put it. And so what I was coming out with as a result of my analysis was that, in fact, trade and globalization, and more generally, not financial flows, has a human face. It doesn't lack one. It doesn't need one, but it has a human face. On balance, it advances its agenda. So let me give you a couple of examples, because these, right now it's in low key. But it's never going to be completely gone, these concerns, right? Because they come with modern society today, and the young people continue to be agitated by such concerns, and civil society does that too. I'll give you child labor, for instance. Would child labor really increase, as a result of globalization? Why should it? That was my first reaction. Think of, I'll put it in sociological terms, wicked parents and virtuous parents. A wicked parent might say, if I'm able to now export rice, a true example in Vietnam, which there's a study on it, you get 30% increase in your earnings. What are you going to do then? Are you going to take a child away from school and put her into work? Because you're getting it's what economists call income effect. There's more income to be had. So a wicked parent will say, yeah, I'm going to use a child for work rather than send to school. A virtuous parent would do the other way. He would say, look, I don't need the income now, really, and so I'm going to put one child, take it away from work and put her into school. And actually, a lot of studies show that parents are virtuous, and therefore globalization or trade, in this case lifting of export controls on rice exports, had led to improved peasant earnings and had led to more children being schooled, and a double dividend was many of the girl children were also being sent to school. And so that was a big payoff. In economic terms, we simply say, economics reinforces this. I was putting it in sociological terms, but in economic terms, and we know that from our own educational system, that there may be a high rate of return, but you can't borrow money. the capital market is not working, so you have to be able to borrow the money to be able to pay for an education, which in fact is going to be, really paying you a very high rate of return. Rates of return on education at the lower levels are very high, but peasants can't borrow money. So it's what we call imperfect credit markets. When you actually earn more money, then your budget constraint is reduced automatically. It's not even a loan, it's your own income. And therefore, you will, in fact, send more children to school to get that high rate of return. So here, economics and sociology tend to interact, but there are a variety of arguments like that. So in fact, while lots of NGOs I'd read, and many in India, have earned the Robert Kennedy Prize and so on and so forth, award for work on children, they just started and ended with the presumption that globalization and trade in particular was really bad for people. It just wasn't bad. Same thing again for gender issues. I looked at pay, the literature on what happens to pay inequality. Because as you know, certainly in the law schools, because the current Chief Justice has also brought up that issue. I mean, there are three ways of looking at pay inequality. One is where you have comparable worth. I mean, there's two professors, one woman and one man with the same qualifications, and you pay the man more. I mean, that's easier to determine. Of course, you still have to do econometric analysis, and there's evidence in that happens. That there is discrimination. But then we also have the European approach of comparable worth across occupations and so on. Like, what are you paying somebody here and in the law school, and then you're comparing that with somebody in the local municipal office or something. Just because some pay commission decides they are comparable, therefore should get the same wages. I think it comes from the public sector commissions and so on how to set pays. But that's a European one, and I have seen Chief Justice Roberts saying this is for the birds, and actually I totally agree with him. It's totally arbitrary. And then there's a mega question. What happens when women go into low-paying jobs? Because that's the way they're brought up. And partly the pay is less because women are going to go into it. So but whatever is the cause and effect, women tend to get paid less because they choose occupations which are worth, which pay less. That's a question of changing the entire social attitudes and the way, men and women get allocated to work. And there too, I discuss how when the Japanese multinationals came to, men came with the Japanese multinationals because women just bring tea in the old days and, bow and, they're not supposed to do anything. They're not allowed to do anything. But when the wives came with the executives who were men into New York and Paris and Rome and London, and they saw how women were being treated in the Western society. So they went back and became agents for change. And there's a lot of evidence that Japanese society, therefore, has been changing as a result of, not just this, students also learn these things, right, when they come. But it's really the multinationals and trade also lead to these kinds of contacts, diffusion of ideas, and so people change. So actually, throughout the book on everything, I came up with a view that on balance, the trade was good, not bad, for social agendas, and therefore, that critique I don't buy at all. But now, today, the economic critique coming from essentially the fear or the self-interest has become a very dominant issue. When I was writing the book, there was one chapter on what happens to the wages of our workers as a result of trade and investment, but that really was a low key. It wasn't a big issue in the early 90s. Today, it's a very big issue, and in fact, it's infecting democratic politics because the unions believe that trade is actually undermining wages and in fact, destroying jobs as well. So Kerry had to worry about it. It began around that time, that particular campaign, and he actually, and I think it had partly to do also with the fact that Lou Dobbs is on every night. And I'm told, it's two insider stories, and maybe Dean Fitz knows something more, because you're even better connected than I am. But I was told that when Kerry said that the firms which were outsourcing were Benedict Arnold's, when I first saw that, I didn't know who the hell Benedict Arnold was, but I thought since Kerry had been to Yale, and at that time I thought he had attended his classes, unlike Bush, but he also cut his classes apparently. And he got worse grades than Bush, which is astonishing. It just shows he's a brilliantly capable man. I mean, it takes a lot of hard work to get bad grades. And so he said, this was a trader apparently, and none of us foreigners know that. This is a great trader. I thought he was just probably an English poet, a remote, a distant cousin of Matthew Arnold or someone, but it turned out to be a trader. So where did he get this from? Because that's, suddenly he was there. And he got it from these focus groups, apparently, who obviously don't watch Charlie Rose or Lehrer NewsHour. They watch Lou Dobbs, all of them. So Lou Dobbs has this list of firms which are, like in Robin Hood films, of people who are actually the treacherous firms and so on. So that's where the idea came from, that these were traitors. And so all the lights went off, and and the question was asked, are the firms traitors? Yes, of course they are. And that got conveyed to Kerry's campaign. And the next day, they did that. The other insider story was that as soon as Bob Rubin saw that, he called up John Kerry and said, if you repeat this, I'm out of your campaign. So I think poor chap, he was like Buridan's ass, caught between two things, and he never mentioned trade again, fortunately. But that is really there is in fact a general atmosphere that trade is actually, a source of pressure on our wages and jobs. And that was sort of coming up during that campaign. It's only gotten worse since then, because we have long-run stagnation in wages for about 25 years. And so that is something which I think is now a relatively big issue. The second one, of course, is that people are just petrified about India and China. Now, our good friend Tom Friedman is a great he thinks he's pro-globalization. But when he says the earth is flat, people immediately think of, the gladiator leading Roman troops, all lock in step towards us on a flat road, and they're going to go marching all over us and trample us down, all right? So actually, Friedman, who's a good friend, in my view, is responsible for this flat earth view, which leads to the notion that we couldn't possibly compete with these guys because they have lower wages. He doesn't say that, but that's the way people think about it, that here are guys who are very smart in India and China, huge numbers of them, between them 2.5 billion at least, right? They're really going to take our jobs away. And then into that is fed the fact that outsourcing occurred around that same time too. And that is where, one Indian guy, doctor in Mass General Hospital, sent x-rays digitally to his friend in Bombay, I think, over the weekend, and got the diagnosis back. And from that, the Mass General Hospital Director General, who is fortunately not an economist, he would be an embarrassment if he was to our profession, but he said that everything was going to go there, right? All the jobs that were going to disappear from Mass General, and he would be left with a hollow shell, right? And so that became a very big issue as well. So from different directions, you are getting this kind of input that somehow trade, outsourcing, investment abroad, taking jobs away, all of this is adding up, and the trade is putting pressure on our wages and jobs. All of that, I think, has really intensified the feeling that we have to do this. Now, so that is one thing I want to address now very quickly, and then we'll go into Q&A. Okay. Now, India and China, let me just take that, because that's, again, courtesy of Tom, I think, because he focuses on India and China quite a bit. These are big countries. Now, when we have big countries, they create big fears. And There is a Russian proverb which says fear has big eyes, but I would add one more line to that and say it also has deaf ears. Because once you're petrified and frightened, it's very difficult to listen to good reason, right? But you have to try. Now, India and China are very big countries. So people really think, okay, outsourcing, calling up people for call answer services when your Dell doesn't work and you have to get it fixed. That sort of thing, back office operations are just going to multiply like hell because we've got 1.2 billion people. Actually, the cost curve, or the supply curve as we call it, is upward rising. A lot of people I've talked to are actually moving away from India into Eastern Europe and other places. Why is this so? Because when you start looking at the reality on the ground, you have to know English, okay? So now, first, start with the first step. How many people in India who are age cohorts for getting educated, 18 to 21? 12% go to college, all right? That's a big number. Of that, a small fraction studies in English, right? Because local languages have taken over in large parts of the country. Of that, a very small fraction can actually speak English. Of that, a still tiny fraction can speak English in a way which you and I can understand, all right? By the time you multiplied all these fractions together, it's of the nth order of smalls, right? And there's really nothing to worry about, actually. I mean, I went to a Catholic school, and I thought I was, and I was seeing Hollywood films, of course, in Bombay. So when I went to England, I thought I spoke perfectly good English, but it was actually a mix of Spanish from the Jesuits and of Hollywood, so nobody understood me. I was really very upset. So at the end of 2 years, I spoke pretty good English, actually, because I have a good ear. And then I come to America, and then it doesn't matter how you speak, because everybody has a different accent. So, wasted 2 years of learning proper English. But anyway, so this is a big thing. I mean, so I think once you've scaled it down, Chinese engineers, people like, all kinds of very serious people were on a committee recently of the Congress. And they talk about how so many more engineers are coming out from China than in the United States. Well, what about the quality? And we know that from Indian education also. Now, of course, quality doesn't have to be always very high. If all you're doing is repairing bridges, doing little buildings and so on, doesn't really matter if you've got a straight line or not, as long as the job gets done in some way. So large numbers of them are going to be employed in local activities of one kind or another, fixing bridges and buildings and so on and so forth. So a few of them will then be required for the international sector. Those are a much smaller fraction. And remember, anybody who knows Chinese history knows that the Cultural Revolution, they decimated the stocks of bourgeoisie. Therefore, they've got to rebuild the stocks also. So by the time you've taken all of these things into account, the Chinese don't look so fierce, right, in terms of competition for us, all right? So I think this is it's just the largeness which creates this. I went to Turkey in '62, and then I was reading up, on Turkish history and Kemal Ataturk and so on. And along with the phase, apparently it's, I was told, I haven't read it myself, but if unless I was misled, he had said that you could not publish a map of Turkey with the Black Sea and the gigantic Soviet Union on top, because he thought the Turks would be petrified looking at this huge country sitting on top of them. Now, that is really the kind of thing, it's a psychological sense we have. And when I went and testified before, Biden's committee, normally you get one or two people there. I don't know what they do. They're always voting, they claim, but they're probably having beer or something somewhere. And, so once in a while somebody comes in, makes a 2-minute speech and goes away. It's a strange way to conduct business if you're really interested in an issue. So here, for the first time, the entire arc was full because China was a big concern. very big concern. And there were Schumerists and all sorts of people shooting questions and, saying, you're complacent, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, and so on and so forth. They were just concerned like hell. So I think this is something, I personally think that this is not something to worry about in the way in which it is, but it does drive the fear of the unions as well, that here are all these very poor, basically countries with abundant labor who are going to swamp us. They've got lower wages than we have. On lower wages, I think Paul Krugman, whom you cited, my best student, and who raced past me for the Nobel, and I'm delighted, because I have a teacher now, Paul Samuelson, who is a Nobel, and my student who is a Nobel. So, well, it's better than not having. It's not as good as not having having the Nobel, but it's just good enough. So Paul Krugman wrote an article saying wages don't, we shouldn't think of national competitiveness because it's not like, in terms of wages and so on. Because when your wages are low, you can adjust for it by an exchange rate change. So wages translate through exchange rates into competitive wages for you, right? And therefore, the mere fact that wages are low elsewhere doesn't really mean anything. And I think he's basically right. And I think that needs to be understood. When I was in India in early 1960s, working in the planning committee, everybody was worried about not being able to compete with you guys here because you had better fed workers, you had human capital, you had financial capital, you had infrastructure, you had everything we didn't have. How the hell could we really compete with you? There was exactly the opposite concern, right? So cheap labor is not, what does it mean? Nothing, right? It doesn't really help you compete. That was equally wrong. We did compete, right? And the Far Eastern economies competed very well. So I think these stereotypes which you have are really very difficult to fight in the public space, but we have to do that because they're the ones which drive you into irrational responses like, oh, we can't really trade with poor countries. If you look at econometric studies of the location of multinationals, and I mean not just labor-intensive ones, because, but across the board, labor costs are hardly important in these studies. It's a variety of other things, infrastructure, tax policy, availability of materials, availability of, good policies in terms of treating you well, not too many interferences for one reason or another by a bureaucracy which doesn't really, which creates problems without solving anything. Those kinds of issues really become very important. So this is not really, the wage issue which drives a lot of discussion is not really something which economic analysis would encourage. And I think this is something you've got to put back into the policy part. And I think this is where the AFL-CIO is kind of wedded now to the notion that the effect of wages, of trade on wages, is really the key thing. Now, when you believe that the effect of trade on wages is adverse and considerable, then you will, in fact, go in for trying to raise the cost of production elsewhere. You will first try to get protection. But protection has now become, despite occasional lapses, a bad word. I mean, I think we've won that much. So what do? You go in a different way. And you say, look, if a beast is charging at me, I can try and hold it by the horn. If I can't do that, or won't do that because, it's not allowed, that's like import protection. I can reach behind the beast, catch it by the tail, and break the charge. I can do neither. It's just an example, all right? And that is what we call in economics export protectionism. You get the other guy costs to rise or intimidate the government to saying, we'll have export restraint. So these are called voluntary export restraints, which are now outlawed, but these are informal. You can't outlaw something effectively, which is informally done between governments. I mean, there's no way you can effectively do that. But the WTO is, in the last round, actually outlawed everything except once. And, most countries have done that formally once, but informally it continues. So these are export protectionism, and that's what unfortunately, this fear that trade is affecting wages is leading to export protectionism. So when Senator Obama, who is a great guy in my view, he is actually into saying we must have fair trade, we must have we have to look at the time for free trade. That's what he said in the debate. And he is actually, in a manner of speaking, he understands what we understand, that, U.S. cannot live without trade, and free trade is a good thing. And remember, I was telling Joe Biden, because Joe Biden is very funny, actually. So after my testimony, I went up, and there was this Obama seat there, which was vacant, of course. He was busy campaigning. So we first joked to saying maybe it should be outsourced to Hillary, that seat. And then I responded by saying that, why are people worried about his going to this pastor? Because I said, in my experience, everybody falls asleep during sermons. Nobody listens to sermons. They've got to be stupid if they do. But for 10 years, I said, he's been talking to the Chicago Business School people. So I said, you better make sure he's really a liberal. So he said, yeah, I'm going to do that. And of course, he then signed up for it. But I think he's for free trade. There's no question in my mind. He's got to throw some bones at people, at this constituency. But I think he does believe that fair trade is important. And I think, you can't be listening to this kind of stuff all the time without really imbibing some of it. The way you capture people, the way people bribe people, businesses bribe us is by putting us on boards. And why do they put us on boards? It's not just the 50,000 or whatever you get. I haven't got anything, but I know people who have been on boards, and they get 25 to 50,000. But it's not that they're being bought in some obvious way. It's just that when you go there, you hear all the things, they're catching your ear. Right, so you get to hear things which you would not otherwise, which represent your point of view. So during the Japan bashing days, General Motors, everybody who was worried about Japanese competition, were busy putting many of my friends on the boards. And over time, I saw suddenly they became Japan bashers themselves, because all they heard was the wicked ways of the Japanese and so on and so forth in these boards. So that's the way it works, basically. And so I think, essentially, if all you get from the unions and from the people who are giving you, your support, financial support and ringing bells and so on, because unions are very powerful. They give you not merely cash, but also labor. And that's very important, powerful too. That, I think, is likely to push him into export protectionism. I don't think he quite understands what it is. Because his advisors do. I've talked with Austin Goolsbee and so on. So, but at the moment, he may have to go along with that. And the more worrisome thing is that most of the Democrats will be getting elected. They're going to be very much into it, like the last Congress. They were all into fair trade in this particular way, and so it's going to be just more of the same. And then once you have that, no president, how enlightened he is on trade, is going to be able to function effectively. So I think anybody who gets into it will have to do it. Now, we'll have to contend with this. And so I think the thing to do will be to keep it in low key. I don't think we can get rid of it at all. It's simply out. As far as the international multilateral negotiations are concerned, like the Doha round, the unions accept the fact that they're not going to be able to get anything done there, simply because it is not India, Brazil, South Africa, all these big countries. They just object to it as simply a form of protectionism. And they say, we're going to we are democratic countries, we set our own standards. And in a way, also U.S. is in a very peculiar position, because on labor standards, for instance, we are not really the worst leaders. Less than 10% of our labor force in the private sector is unionized. Two, we haven't even ratified all of the core labor ILO conventions. We break strikes. the Human Rights Watch has brought out, because I urged Ken Roth to do something symmetric for us, and they say we violate the right to unionize by essentially crippling the right to strike. And I've seen it on my own campus that, liberal presidents will actually, not let any strike action really get through. So we are not the world's best people to do this. So we want to actually push for it, and we are doing it. We're not able to succeed at the WTO in the multilateral negotiation, and the unions have accepted that more or less. So that part is safe. But in the free trade agreements, we pick, weak partners and then force these things on them. Part of it is, of course, a Leninist strategy. The more and more countries you catch one by one, little ones, and politically unequal bargains, and you dangle the U.S. market before them, which in any case is reasonably open in my view, but you dangle it before them or threaten them and say that you will stop receiving one-way preferences, and therefore your trade barriers will actually rise. Both EU and US have been doing that. Recently, US did that with Costa Rica, saying you will be deprived of your what is called generalized scheme of preferences, which is a one-way preference. We will remove that unless you sign on to this, because GSP is at an end as far as you're concerned. So we use tough tactics on little countries to do it, and then in a way, sort of the more and more countries sign on to it, the weaker the coalition of the developing countries against this kind of game at Geneva. So in a way, we'll continue playing that game for a while. I'm not in. So FTAs are another story, but I think essentially, as far as the WTO, Doha, et cetera, are concerned, I'm not too worried about this kind of export protectionism playing a major role. So I think maybe one could be a little bit more relaxed about it. But essentially, what it does is to divert the United States from doing what is necessary, in my opinion, in the modern economy. And that's where I feel that there are what we need is a holistic view of where we are. It's a kind of new epoch that's the phrase I use, because internationally it's not the poor rich country problem. I mean, that's as I hope I've given you some indication of why that's not the way to look at the concerns which we have in the labor market. It is essentially a rich country problem, in my view, in the sense that you take Boeing and Airbus, you talk to anybody, any CEO in international competition, it is pretty stiff, pretty fierce. You look behind you, and there's somebody coming up. It doesn't have to be India or China. It could be Germany. It could be Brazil. It could be a variety of countries. You have no thick margins of comparative advantage today. Almost everybody has somebody stealing up on them. So it's just like if you're Maria Callas, you can't afford to relax and drop a note, even a high note, because Tebaldi is waiting in the wings to take over. It's that kind of situation now with most industry. In that situation, the vulnerability or the volatility of comparative advantage becomes an issue. Two, we have very acute and continuous technical change at home, and entire assembly lines disappear. Now, if you took a child to, in my case, a granddaughter, which I don't have, and I took her to see Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, and she says, grandfather, take me to see an assembly line. I can't find one, almost. I will find assembly lines, but they're being managed by robots. There are 5 guys up there in a glass cage managing them. The Charlie Chaplins have disappeared now. They're not over there. So many of the layoffs are substantial layoffs, a lot of assembly lines have gone out that way. And if you look at the actual proportion of the people laid off to the labor force in the non-financial sector, one of the Chicago Business School's experts on this pointed out, the proportion has been falling, not rising. And yet there's acute anxiety because I think it's the large numbers which are really important. Like if a big airline crashes, like one of the new Airbuses with 800 passengers, that will create an enormous impact compared to 40 airlines, with 20 passengers each, and so on. So I think there is a kind of psychological side to this, but these two factors have combined to create a sense of fragility of jobs, volatility of jobs, higher turnover, because you can't hold on to your jobs. And I think that is where we are coming, that's what we are coming to. So I'm writing a book on this, on economic anxiety and how to handle protectionism for Obama, I hope, and essentially saying that if this is really at the heart of the problem of living today, that you can't have secure jobs. There's going to be continuous volatility, uncertainty, and so on, and you're never going to be able to get out of it because you just can't. I mean, that's the way the modern system is. If that is so, then everything has to change in many dimensions, like education. My friend Alan Blinder says, we must stop having, rote learning, and we must have more analytical. That's like we must have sisterhood. Of course. On the other hand, we shouldn't knock out rote learning either. I wish I had a better memory and had learned more rote learning too. But leave that aside. There's nothing special there about what's going on. What I would like to see, of course, is if you're going to be thrown off Boeing in Seattle, and Honda is expanding autos, you should be able to move from one kind of engineering to another, right? If radiology is being outsourced, we at the same time have obesity-related expansion of, diabetes, hepatitis, even liposuction, if you like, and so on and so forth. All of those are new jobs coming up, but how do you make a trajectory from radiology, in which you specialize onto this? So you have to have optimal trajectories of transition. To allow engineers to move, you have to make sure that they learn there's less specialization and more building of a larger base from which you can operate. So there are a variety of things we need to do if volatility is at the heart of the problem. And I think this is where I feel that really serious thinking is necessary, and I think Obama is just doing the standard things, like healthcare is important, obviously, and we need that in any case, right? But we need to also have a view of what's going on. What is the nature of the modern economy, including the globalization part? And what is it making you do? And I think the general attitude on trade also will affect even things like healthcare, in my opinion. So that's the last thought I'll do. Because I had an article in Wall Street Journal, and 15 years ago I wrote one too, saying trade in or transactions in medical services could also reduce the cost. If you look at what happened to the Massachusetts, Mitt Romney's program, a lot of people were insured, but they couldn't get doctors. There was just a shortage of doctors. Nobody was willing to take these guys. Then Schwarzenegger, he also went in for a comprehensive reform, but he didn't have money to pay for people's medical service. So we have problems of scarcity of people, of doctors, and we have problems with the cost of the whole program. So it's not enough just to say, I want comprehensive coverage. So in my view, if you are able to do things like medical tourism, you can actually reduce costs very considerably. I have several estimates with someone who really knows about these things. And LBJ, during the Great Society program, imported a lot of doctors who were given, provided they went and worked in the Appalachia and so on and so forth, could get 5-year visas and then settle. So you could really creatively use transactions in medical services to do it. But I don't know. I mean, this does mean that you've got to bring the American Medical Association or bear the lion in his own den, and whether they're willing to do it or not. But in a way, international trade affects so many things we can do and we need to do that I think really they need to sit down after the election and really sort a number of these things out. But at the heart of it will be a more benign and understanding attitude towards international trade, in my view. And I'm reasonably optimistic that Obama will have some ability to do it. I talked with a couple of people who were in the Clinton campaign and then went on to Obama's campaign, and they said the difference was that the Clintons wanted to be the smartest people, no matter what was being discussed, including maybe physics or something. And Obama listens. And I think this is why I'm really optimistic that he will be able to entertain ideas and be able to surmount, or work against his party skepticism to a straight. But he's got his work cut out for him. Thank you.